It was a Sunday morning in June, June 7th, 1992, and 3 cars sat in the driveway of a small house on East Delmar in Springfield, Missouri. 2 cups of coffee might have sat on the counter. A little dog, Cinnamon, paced the rooms. And by mid-morning, 3 women were simply gone.
Wow. That image really sets the scene, Mara. The combination of ordinary domestic detail and total absence is, from a criminologist's perspective, one of the most unsettling things about this case.
Yeah, Lucas. And the 3 women, Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, were ordinary in the way that makes this hit harder. A single mother and cosmetologist, and 2 teenagers who had just graduated high school. Their names are often reduced to headlines, but I want to begin by giving listeners a real sense of who they were.
Please do. It's important. Sherrill Levitt was 47, worked at New Attitudes Hair Salon, owned the house at 1717 East Delmar, and was described as hard-working and responsible. Suzie Streeter was 19, a recent Kickapoo High School graduate who worked at a movie theater, and Stacy McCall was 18, working at the Springfield Gymnastics Center, reliable, according to her mother Janice.
Right. Sherrill had a routine, a doctor's appointment scheduled for Monday, June 8th, and shifts coming up at the salon, things she missed. Suzie had a Tuesday shift at the theater she didn't show up to. Stacy missed her Monday shift at the gym. Small facts like that underline how out of character their disappearances were.
Exactly. When people with regular schedules disappear, investigators focus on that gap, who would benefit from their sudden absence and who might have been nearby during those hours. But in 1992, investigative tools and community practices were different. Landlines, answering machines, limited CCTV, and a very different DNA landscape.
Let's walk the timeline together, Lucas. Graduation day, June 6th, 1992. Suzie and Stacy graduated at around 4 p.m. Sherrill attended. Later that night, they skipped the school lock-in and went to parties instead. Can you take us through what happened after that, from the last confirmed sighting?
Sure. The last confirmed sighting of Suzie and Stacy is about 2 a.m., leaving graduation parties. They were believed to head to Sherrill's home on East Delmar. The FBI summarizes the disappearance window as between roughly 2:15 and 7:30 a.m. on June 7th, which is the critical period investigators focus on.
So we have that roughly 5-hour window. Then, at about 9 a.m., Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend Mike Henson, friends, went to the Delmar house because Suzie and Stacy hadn't met them to go to Whitewater and Branson. They found the front door unlocked, all 3 cars in the driveway, and the porch light globe shattered, though the bulb was intact. Mike swept up the glass, unintentionally destroying potential evidence.
And that's a crucial point. A compromised scene, people coming and going, items moved or cleaned, greatly reduces the amount of usable forensic evidence. In this case, multiple visitors that day likely contaminated latent prints, trace fibers, and any potential footwear impressions outside the home.
It's heartbreaking, because you can almost feel the evidence slipping away. Inside the house, TV left on, purses lined up in a bedroom, clothing folded, Cinnamon the dog anxious but alive. No obvious signs of violent struggle, no ransom note, nothing like that.
It's difficult. Normal domestic scenes with missing people lead to competing possibilities. Were they lured out? Were they willing to leave? Or did an efficient, quiet abduction occur? The lack of forced entry points toward either a perpetrator they knew or someone who tricked them into opening the door, something that becomes central to many of the theories.
Let's pause there. The scene contamination kept bothering me as I reviewed the material. Friends and relatives, perhaps acting out of concern, cleaned ashtrays, moved cups, swept up glass. Someone even reported obscene phone calls to a visitor that day, 2 calls with explicit remarks. They were dismissed as pranks then, but later considered potentially important. That kind of messy human response how does it shape a cold case?
It shapes it profoundly. In 1992, preserving a scene wasn't as intuitive for the public as it is now. Today, people are more aware to lock the door and wait for police. Back then, a crowd of 10 to 20 people in a home before police arrival could obliterate trace elements. The erased answering machine message is another example. A single button press removed a possible clue in an era before messages were digitally backed up.
The erased message. It almost reads like a motif in this story. The silenced voice. We also have the later America's Most Wanted caller on New Year's Eve, 1992, who sounded like he had prime knowledge, but the call dropped and he never returned. And then, silence. Those cut-off calls, they linger.
They do. From an investigative standpoint, dropped calls, erased messages, anonymous tips that evaporate, those are maddening, because they often point to real information that, for a mix of technical and human reasons, never gets captured. In this case, the FBI accepted the matter into VICAP, and the investigation has stayed open, but evidence was limited from the outset.
Let's go through the major theories, Lucas, carefully. First, stranger abduction. The idea that an unknown perpetrator or perpetrators quietly abducted all 3 women in the early morning hours. What supports that, and what makes it hard to accept?
Support, the shattered porch globe and the possible tampering with a phone cord could suggest premeditation, someone hindering light and communication. A stranger could have lured the women outside, claiming car trouble or as a nurse or cop with a reason, and taken them. But taking 3 adults simultaneously is logistically complex. It often implies a weapon or multiple offenders, which you'd think might prompt more neighbor reporting, though not necessarily in a brief, quiet abduction.
Right. The second theory is that someone they knew, friends, acquaintances, exes, were involved. That idea is bolstered by the unlocked door and the lack of struggle. And then there's the Dustin Rekla angle, which the public keeps returning to. Suzie had cooperated with police in a case about mausoleum vandalism involving Rekla and associates. That led to a retaliation theory. Police, though, never publicly named him as a primary suspect. Thoughts?
Retaliation is plausible in principle. Someone tied to a crime that Suzie helped report could seek revenge. But investigators need corroboration. And according to available public records, Rekla was never charged in relation to the disappearances, and law enforcement has not publicly identified him as a main suspect. So it's a theory with circumstantial hooks, but without the kind of evidence that would elevate it beyond suspicion.
Then there's the organized crime hypothesis tied to Sherrill's past relationships, rumors about a man with alleged mob connections. That theory tends to circulate in media whenever cases like this lack obvious suspects. But from the official materials, law enforcement didn't prioritize organized crime in their public statements. So again, plausible for some, not substantiated.
Correct. Organized crime is sometimes invoked to explain professional disappearances, but it should be handled cautiously. Public documentation, FBI VICAP summaries, and local police comments do not highlight a strong organized crime link as the leading theory. Without clear motive and corroboration, it remains a hypothesis rather than a supported line of investigation.
One of the more persistent and haunting threads is the parking garage theory, the claim that the women were buried beneath the Cox Hospital South parking garage. In 2007, a GPR scan reportedly showed 3 anomalies consistent in size and arrangement with possible grave sites. The tip, however, was initially received in the 1990s, and police said the tipster offered no solid evidence. Please unpack this, Lucas.
Okay, the tip that they were buried under the Cox Hospital parking structure raised eyebrows because it's concrete and specific. Rick Norland, an engineer commissioned by a reporter, found anomalies with ground-penetrating radar, 3 shapes in a configuration some read as suspicious.
but law enforcement pointed out timing problems. Construction on that garage began in September 1993, more than a year after the disappearances, making it logistically odd. GPR anomalies can be many things: pipes, voids, construction artifacts. Without stronger corroboration, police considered the tip not credible.
And yet, in public imagination, it persists. It becomes one of those examples of how a single evocative lead can take on a life of its own. Online sleuths, local debates, people saying it must be true. But the reality is more prosaic. GPR isn't definitive, and police balanced cost against probability and decided not to excavate.
Which, from a resources perspective, is understandable. Excavating a hospital parking structure is enormously expensive and disruptive. Law enforcement needs probable cause or stronger corroborating evidence before undertaking something of that scale. Still, the existence of such a tip and the public's unease illustrates the tension between investigative caution and public demand for action.
Let's talk about Robert Craig Cox. He's one of the more sensational names tied to this case. Convicted kidnapper and robber, suspected by some of being a killer. In 1997, he claimed he knew the Springfield Three were murdered and that their bodies would never be found. But he refused to give details, saying he would only talk when his mother died. Police described him as an unreliable narrator. What should listeners make of that?
Cox is a classic example of a dangerous informant dynamic, a violent offender who injects himself into a high-profile case claiming knowledge. Without corroborative details, specific locations, dates, actions, such claims are effectively worthless for investigative progress. Law enforcement must vet such leads carefully. Cox's story drew attention, but investigators found no evidence tying him directly to the disappearances.
And then there are the many jailhouse false confessions and fabricated leads over the decades. People leading police to fields, then admitting they made it up later. That pattern not only wastes resources, it damages public trust and inflicts additional pain on the families. Janice McCall, in particular, has been tireless in keeping Stacy's voice alive, organizing searches, interviews, remembrances. She said she never imagined saying 25 years later that Stacy was still missing.
Janice's persistence exemplifies what happens when a case lacks closure. Family members become the primary keepers of memory and the de facto advocates for continued attention. That energy keeps tips coming and prevents a case from being lost entirely, but it also exposes families to endless rehashing and sensationalism, especially as the story gains national attention on shows like America's Most Wanted.
I want to step back and talk about forensics. In 1992, DNA testing existed but wasn't as widely available, and small departments often lacked routine resources. The Springfield scene was compromised early on. So what could have been lost, and what might modern techniques be able to recover if items were preserved?
What was likely lost, latent fingerprints on the door, the porch globe, the phone, and the answering machine, footwear impressions in the yard, trace fiber and hair evidence from bedding and furniture, any possible touch DNA on cups or cigarettes. If physical items were preserved, cigarette butts, cups, or fabric, modern touch DNA techniques, advanced latent print recovery, and DNA database comparisons might yield something, but contamination makes interpretation tricky. The erased answering machine message is a particularly bitter symbol. One fragile analog recording, gone.
So the possibility exists, but it's conditional. If preserved, modern tech could help. If not, we are left with memories, tips, and gaps. Speaking of tips, over the years, authorities logged more than 5,000 tips. Some were promising, some were false, some were self-serving. How does an investigation triage that volume, Lucas?
It's a triage of credibility, corroboration, and resources. Investigators evaluate whether a tip offers verifiable details, specific locations, dates, corroborating witnesses, physical artifacts. Many tips lack such anchors. Over 5,000 tips is a huge number for a community the size of Springfield, which illustrates both public interest and the difficulty of separating signal from noise.
Let's be clear with listeners. Despite missteps and the compromised scene, the police did pursue thousands of leads and various searches, neighborhood canvases, cadaver dogs, sonar searches of bodies of water, even later GPR efforts initiated by the press. So the idea that investigators did nothing is a misconception we should clean up.
Agreed. It's a misconception to say no follow-up occurred, but early errors, minutes and hours matter, did reduce the potential store of physical evidence. Still, investigators kept the case active. It's listed in the FBI's VICAP, periodically republicized around anniversaries, and remains unsolved.
I want to touch on the human cost again. The community changed after this. Doors locked more, parents reconsidered teen freedoms, and the worry settled in. The house at 1717 E. Delmar became a symbol, a frozen scene in the imagination. How important is the cultural imprint of a case like this to its longevity?
Very important. Cases that touch on communal safety and ordinary domestic life tend to stick in public memory longer. That cultural imprint maintains media attention, encourages tip submissions, and sometimes pressures renewed searches. However, it also invites speculative storytelling and online sleuthing, which can do harm when it spreads unverified claims about private individuals.
On that note, I want to caution listeners. Online sleuthing can be helpful when it surfaces overlooked public records, but it can be harmful when it circulates rumors about family members and friends. Families like Janice's have repeatedly said they want respectful, fact-driven coverage. We owe them that. Lucas, do you think a resolution is still possible?
Yes, it's possible. Cold cases are solved in many ways. Deathbed confessions, someone discovering remains during construction, or new DNA matches from retested evidence. The question is whether material exists that can be tested, and whether someone with real knowledge will come forward. Law enforcement consistently says even small memories matter. Someone who recalls that weekend in June 1992 might hold a key detail.
It feels like we're circling back to that motif of voice and silence. The erased message, the dropped AMW caller, people who might have known but stayed quiet. It's an ethical call, too. We, as a public and as storytellers, have to avoid sensationalism and keep attention on the people. I try, on Still Unanswered, to bring them forward as humans. Sherrill, the cosmetologist and mother, Suzie, the newly that, Stacy, the responsible young woman her mother describes.
And that ethical framing matters in investigative terms, too. When coverage is respectful and focuses on facts, families are more likely to engage, tips are more likely to be credible, and the narrative remains anchored in real lives rather than conspiracy. It's not just compassion, it's good investigative practice.
Let me ask you something, Lucas. Sort of a technical curiosity. The GPR scan under the Cox garage, performed in 2007 by Rick Norland. Given what we know about how GPR works, how should people interpret those 3 anomalies that he reported?
GPR detects subsurface density contrasts. Voids, metal, pipes, and disturbed earth can produce echoes that look like anomalies. 3 anomalies arranged in a pattern can be eyebrow-raising, but GPR is not proof of graves. Without excavation and corroborating context, construction records, soil testing, or historical disturbance data, those echoes remain ambiguous. Law enforcement's position to require stronger corroboration before a costly dig is consistent with forensic standards.
So, in short, evocative but not conclusive. People want answers, and that image circulates because it's powerful, but the science doesn't give us a slam dunk. Switching tracks, what about the small physical details inside the house that still bother me? Bent blinds, a porch probe shattered with the bulb intact, a pulled phone cord. What do those little anomalies usually indicate in a case like this?
They indicate action in and around entry points and communication devices. Bent blinds may suggest someone peeking or someone reaching in. A broken globe with an intact bulb could mean it was struck rather than purposefully removed, maybe someone trying to remove the lights cover. A pulled phone cord suggests either a struggle near the phone or an attempt to disable calling. Each detail is suggestive but not definitive. They have to be interpreted together, not in isolation.
Those interpretations can be slippery because they invite multiple readings. I want to highlight one more human thread: the obscene calls reported by a visitor that day. 2 calls with sexual innuendo were received by a guest and initially shrugged off. To me, that's the kind of detail that looks minor until it isn't. How would investigators treat that?
They would treat it as potentially significant but hard to trace historically. In 1992, caller ID was not ubiquitous, and phone records could be sparse. Investigators would try to get phone company records, trace calls, and correlate timing. But if the scene was so compromised, and if the calls weren't recorded, proving a link between those calls and the disappearances is difficult. It remains, however, an unsettling, anomalous detail that investigators would not ignore.
Let's talk about the families again. Janice McCall, the public face of Stacy's family, has been tireless. She organized searches, kept media attention alive, and supported other families. She said she never imagined she'd be marking decades of unanswered questions. That human persistence feels like the backbone of why this case hasn't faded completely.
Absolutely. Family advocacy transforms cold files into living inquiries. It compels periodic reviews, ensures media reminders at anniversaries, and sometimes prompts new tips. Janice's decades of activism are a testament to how missing persons investigations often depend on survivors to keep institutional memory alive.
We've covered the timeline, the scene, the contamination, the theories, the GPR, and the families. Before we wrap, Lucas, can you summarize where the official record stands today?
Officially, the FBI and Springfield police list the 3 women as missing. The case is unsolved. Over the years, police have investigated thousands of leads, pursued searches, and kept the case in VICAP. Periodic public appeals around anniversaries encourage anyone with information to come forward. But as of the most recent public reporting, no definitive resolution has been reached.
So, unresolved but active in record. I want to close with a few narrative images, some anchors to hold for listeners. 1. 3 cars parked in a driveway and a small dog inside. 2. An answering machine light and the erased message. 3. A parking garage with 3 GPR anomalies that may or may not mean anything. Those images help us remember the ordinary things that were left behind.
They do. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this. Someone out there might hold a memory or a detail, a voice, a sighting, a passing remark, that could change everything. Investigators often emphasize that even small memories matter. The case remains open for that possibility.
If you have anything to share about that weekend in June 1992, please contact the FBI or Springfield Police Department. And if you're listening and you think of a small detail, share it. It's those small things that can sometimes open the door. Lucas, any final thought?
Only this. Keep the humanity in the center. Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy were people with jobs, families, plans. When we talk about theories, let's not forget them. And keep reporting tips to the proper authorities, not just online forums. That's how cold cases get solved.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, listeners, for sitting with this difficult story. Quietly, respectfully. We'll put links to the FBI VICAP page and the public resources in the episode notes. Until next time, I'm Mara Ellison, and this is Still Unanswered.
Thanks for having me, Mara. Good work as always.